Coalition and Fund for Women's Equality. We're comprised of over 120 organizations across the country, representing millions of women and men who believe in equality. Our goal is to fix the Constitution so discrimination based on sex is actually prohibited. An amendment takes passage by Congress. Well, we got that in 1972, and it takes ratification by 38 states. That's a pretty tall order. We got that on January 27th of 2020. So today, we celebrate the one-year anniversary of getting that 38th state, Virginia. Our thanks to the tireless legislators like Virginia Delegate Jennifer Carroll Foy and Senator Jennifer McClellan, and our coalition partners in Virginia and across the country who gave us that state. Last year, this time, we were cheering in the State House galleries. We believe that 2021 is the year of the ERA. We have a time limit written into the amendment's introduction that we still have to deal with. We have letters signed by nearly 200 organizations intended for President Biden and Vice President Harris, asking them for speedy action. Last week, the Senate and the House of Representatives introduced legislation to remove the time limit, so we are almost there. And we're so glad that you're here with us tonight. It is now my pleasure to introduce an extraordinary activist and philanthropist, Ruth Ann Harnish. She's founder and president of the Harnish Foundation. Ruth Ann and I have always bonded over our previous careers as television journalists back in the day. Ruth Ann is an Emmy award-winning anchor and correspondent, and through her foundation has profoundly changed the lives of so many women here, and we're happy to have the Harnish Foundation support our series of town halls this year and next year. Ruth Ann, thank you so much, and good to see you.
It's always great to see you, Carol. We have in common our reporting background, and that means that we believe storytelling can really help to change the culture. And that's why when Carol asked the Harnish Foundation to become the title sponsor, to tell the stories of why we need the Equal Rights Amendment to guarantee equal protection under the law, equal rights under the law for all, I was really eager to say yes to sponsoring the entire series of town hall meetings, because one of my highest values is to design a world that works for everyone. That's why I support the ERA. That's why I support Respectability. And you'll hear more about that organization in a minute from Tatiana Lee, who is our moderator for tonight. And we are hoping that this series of town hall meetings will help us design the world that works for everyone, starting with some of the people we've defined out of the mainstream, defined them as not something, instead of designing for the fact that they're really something, as we say in New York. And one of the first people that I knew calling attention to the need to design for everyone and normalize the world for people that the so-called normies have defined as disabled is Lorraine Arbus. Throughout her life as an artist, an activist, and a philanthropist, Lorraine has taken every opportunity to shine a spotlight on the disability community. And it must be very gratifying for Lorraine to finally see the world paying attention at long last to the issues that she's been spotlighting for decades. Here's my friend, Lorraine Arbus.
Thank you, Ruth Ann. You're one of the people I most revere for your and your leadership. You're just so fabulous. I am delighted to be part of today's virtual town hall, and I wanted to take a moment to talk about the largest minority in the United States, and in the world for that matter, people with disabilities. There are 61 million Americans with disability, and they make up 26% of our country across every group of people. My mother, with the help of my dad, initiated, lobbied, and led a movement in 1973 to amend the Rehabilitation Act by adding Section 504. Section 504 is the groundbreaking predecessor by 17 years to the better known Americans with Disabilities Act, which turned 30 last year. For the first time in our country, Section 504 prohibited discrimination on the basis of disability. It is because of my mother's unique ideas that in every American city, federal laws mandate shaved corners of street curbs, lowered public telephones, enlarged restroom cubicles, ramps in public buildings, and designated parking spaces. However, there's still a really long road ahead for ensuring every disabled American has the same opportunities and chances at success as non-disabled counterparts do. People with disabilities are too often the least accounted for when it comes to equal rights and anti-discrimination practices. They are rarely brought up in the media in discussions of the most vulnerable communities, as evidenced just over the last few months. I heard time and time again about the most vulnerable communities, and a list was run, but no one ever mentioned people with disability. The ERA in concept advances the rights of all women, including women of color, LGBTQ persons, and women with disability. When I think of equal rights, I think first and foremost of accessibility for all. President Joe Biden has given me great hope. He has made the White House a website accessible again. They relaunched the website to also include a statement that commitment to accessibility for all begins with this site and our efforts to ensure all functionality and all content is accessible to all Americans, and that's a quote. His administration will also have American Sign Language interpreters at every White House briefing. Today's panel will be moderated by Tatiana Lee. She serves as a Hollywood Inclusion Associate at Respectability. She learned how to harness social media's power to speak boldly about accessibility and inclusion in mass media due to the lack of access and opportunities for herself. She is spina bifida and others with disabilities. She is the voice behind the Accessible Hollywood brand, which highlights her journey as an award-winning actress, international model, and Hollywood influencer. Tatiana, our moderator.
Thank you so much, Lorraine, for that beautiful introduction. I am so honored to be your moderator for this very powerful discussion today. I want to introduce our panelists. So first we have Brooke Ellison. At the age of 11, Dr. Ellison was in an accident that left her paralyzed from the neck down and dependent on a ventilator to breathe. However, with those circumstances, Dr. Ellison received her undergraduate and master's degree from Harvard University and her PhD from Stony Brook University. In 2002, Dr. Ellison published an autobiography, Miracles Happen, which was later made into a movie directed by Christopher Reeves. Our next panelist is Misunzi. Maysoon is an actress, comedian, writer, and disability advocate. She is a graduate of and a guest comedian in the resident at Arizona State University. Maysoon is the co-founder, co-executive producer of the New York Arab American Comedy Festival and the Muslim Funny Fest. She was a full-time on-air contributor to Countdown with Keith Olbermann and a columnist for the Daily Beast. As a professional comedian, Maysoon has performed in top New York clubs and has toured extensively at home and abroad. She limped in New York Fashion Week and is maybe most importantly, since it was a dream of hers, a reoccurring character on General Hospital. Next, we have Ryan Hadid. Ryan is an actor, playwright, and autobiographical performer based in New York. His acclaimed solo play, Hi, Are You Single?, was presented in the public theaters under the Radar Festival and continues to tour the country. Other New York credits include My Straighties, Noor and Hadid Go to Hogwarts, and the cabaret Falling for Make Believe. You may recognize him from his current reoccurring role on the Netflix series, The Politician. Next, we have Mark Dubbin. Mark Dubbin, Esquire, is the CEO of ADA Expertise Consulting and CEO and founder of Communities Against Violence Network. He formerly serves as a senior trial attorney in the Disability Rights section of the Civil Rights Division at the Justice Department. In that capacity, he was responsible for nationwide enforcement of the ADA and Section 504 on behalf of the United States. In addition, he formerly serves as a special counsel to the Office of Violence Against Women at the Justice Department. Mark also co-founded Disability Without Abuse, which brings together experts in criminal victimization and abuse of people with disabilities. But first, before we go into our questions, let's watch a short video of some of our panelists talking about living with a disability and issues that they face every day.
There's been so many examples of able-bodied actors playing disabled roles. Can you talk a little bit about that?
A large swath of the disabled community feels like you can't actually act disability. And there's visible disability and invisible disability, and we tend to be talking about visible disability because what you're doing when you're trying to act those things is you're mimicking a physical replica of what disability is and not addressing at all that those physical manifestations come from something internal and that you can't imitate them.
Right.
So think of how uncomfortable it would be for someone to sit and play me. Like for you to have to watch someone try to move their mouth the way that I do. You can't do it. It's not something that you can act. So we say, you know, much like race, it can't be played. And on stage, I always say, if a wheelchair user can't play Beyonce, then Beyonce can't play a wheelchair user. And she can usually slay anything, just not that.
Yeah.
People with disabilities are 20% of the population, but we're only 2% of the images that you see on television. 95% are played by non-disabled actors.
Now, you had a situation like this in college. I know
In
you talk about,
college, yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
So I was getting A's in all of my acting classes. I wasn't getting cast in any of the shows. And then my senior year, they decided to do a show called They Dance with Sloan Jackson about a girl with cerebral palsy. I was a girl with cerebral palsy. So I was like, nailed it, and I didn't get it. The head of the theater department said I couldn't do the stunt. The idea that we can't do it, that we can't remember the lines, that we can't handle an 18-hour shoot, that the insurance is not going to cover us. There's a lot of challenges with disabled actors and insurance. There's a lot of challenges in sets being accessible.
In the years that I've been on this earth, I have, in effect, lived two lives. I was born on Long Island, and for the first 11 years of my existence, I lived a very physically active life. I played Little League baseball and soccer. I was a dancer for 9 years, studying tap, jazz, and ballet. I played the cello and sang in the church choir. But my first life ended on September 4th of 1990, and I was hit by a car while walking home from my first day of 7th grade. And all the things that I thought defined me as a person were gone. And I also believe that much of my life was gone also. But it really didn't take me very long to realize the calculation error that I was making. My body wouldn't respond, and I couldn't do some of the things that I'd always done. But my mind and my heart knew that I was exactly the same person that I had always been. And when I gained that understanding for myself, that was the understanding that I wanted everyone else to have about me as well.
I feel very accepted within the disability community. I don't always feel accepted in the LGBT community. I'm gay and I have cerebral palsy. I think that as LGBT people, we feel so marginalized already that when we see people who are different within our own circle, we push them off to the side. We're trying to be normalized. And people don't look at a disability and think normal. I'm normal. I'm just trying to exist in the world. And I need you to make space for me. I need you to. I want to fit in to my own community, which I'm supposed to be able to call my own community.
Could it be that society completely desexualizes people with disabilities?
I am super horny all the time. Once a guy was making out with me and he grabbed my which was fine. I invited him to do that. And then he said, oh, it does work. And I didn't know what to say. Now I would say, yeah, it most certainly does. And you didn't have to grab it in order to find out. We go home and we have sex. We have a lot of sex. Because I think when people see that, they will be more inclined to realize, oh, that person is sexy, and recalibrate their definition of what sexy actually means to include people of all different bodies and different abilities.
Thank you so much. Those were amazing introductions. So let's get into our questions. So the first question I have is for Mark. Do you think the amendment to United States Constitution is unnecessary in the light of the passage of Title IV and the Americans with Disabilities Act and other state and federal anti-discrimination laws?
Well, thank you very much for the question and for the honor of participating today. I've spent my career listening to stories of persons with disabilities and looking at barriers that they've experienced and trying to address those barriers through a legal process. Section 504 was passed in 1973. It took 2 more decades before it was considered discrimination under the law to discriminate on the basis of disability by businesses, because Section 504 limited itself only to recipients of federal financial assistance, courts, police, schools, but businesses were free to discriminate until the passage of the ADA. Now, today happens to be the anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp. And I think about that in terms of the attitude of people towards other people and the protections that are expected by government. Now, my parents are survivors of that concentration camp, and that's what motivated me to go into this field of work. And I have to think that despite the passage of the ADA, despite the passage of other federal civil rights laws, the reality is we can see very clearly and very recently how quickly we can lose it through lack of enforcement, through the, frankly, the posting of individuals who don't work toward enforcing it, but work toward getting rid of it. Now, the Biden administration, I cannot be more pleased with the election of Joe Biden. And I expect that that will, in fact, during his tenure as president, move this forward. But we have to recognize that unless there is a constitutional right, it can be taken away and it can be removed simply by non-enforcement. Mm-hmm. And we know that this is an ongoing battle. So the fact is, there are attitudes that result in barriers. Attitudinal barriers become architectural barriers, become policy barriers, become effective communication barriers. And until this is passed as an equal rights amendment, people with disabilities are going to find that they will continue to experience not just gender discrimination, but gender discrimination and disability discrimination as well. And we know that women with disabilities experience discrimination at far higher levels throughout victims of violence, institutionalization, abuse, sexual assault, a whole range of ways that it's essential that we not rely simply on the good graces of government to allow us our rights, but to recognize that it must be enshrined in the US Constitution so that we have a fighting chance to develop ways to enforce it through the effect of having it as a constitutional amendment. That's my view of it.
Yes, I agree. And my next question is thank you for that answer too, Mark. And my next is for Brooke, and Mark touched on this a little bit, but I want to expand on it a little bit from your point of view. So do women and girls with disabilities, do you think, experience treatment by state and local and federal government differently than men and boys with disabilities? do you think gender really plays a difference?
Sure. So thank you for that question. And thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. So my name is Brooke Ellison. I use the pronouns she, her, hers, and it's a joy to be here sharing some of my thoughts on this really important and unfortunately far too complicated issue. It's really, it's a pleasure to talk to all of you. And yes, I was paralyzed when I was 11 years old in 1990. So the entire time I have lived with disability has been lived kind of under the arc of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So much of my life and where I have gotten throughout these years is very much a product of the activism and advocates who have gone before me. Lorraine and her family, certainly not least among them. So I have a tremendous debt of gratitude to pay to all of them. So you were talking about various really human rights issues that affect obviously all of us, and they have been discussed in many different pieces of legislation, whether it's the Americans with Disabilities Act or the Conventions on Rights for Persons with Disabilities or what have you, or even more recently, the passage of the Sustainable Development Goals and how they affect people's lives around the world. And there are idiosyncratic or characteristic areas that we focus on, whether it's education, employment, poverty, nutrition, healthcare, kind of the real gamut of pressing human rights questions. And as Mark had alluded to, people with disabilities, consistently are underrepresented in these areas, experience tremendous deficits, social deficits in these areas. And that in and of itself is a tragedy, right? That should not happen in any way, shape, or form. And a lot of the deficits that people with disabilities experience are structural in nature, kind of a product of this archaic way of looking at people with disabilities in a very kind of utilitarian or economically driven way, that if you're not producing in a way that we understand production to be, then you're not worthy of your presence in society, right? So this is kind of an archaic, anachronistic way of looking at human beings, and people with disabilities have been left out of the conversation as a result. But despite the fact that that is tragic in and of itself, then there's a gender disparity that is kind of in concert with that, wherein girls and women are kind of duplicatively or multiplicatively, in some instances, affected by marginalization. So marginalized not just because of their disability, but also based on gender, sometimes based on race and ethnicity. And we see this over and over and over again. So women with disabilities are far less likely to have a job. There was a study out of India not too long ago that demonstrated that I think all women with disabilities did not have employment, which is just breathtaking. Is just shocking. Girls with disabilities are far less likely to be educated, to go to school. Actually, I'm just kind of referring to that other study I just mentioned. There is an estimate that I think 25% of women with disabilities are employed, which is a shocking figure, just completely shocking. And then because of those two things, because of the lack of representation in education and employment, then women with disabilities are far more likely to live in poverty, right? Those things go hand in hand. And then there are issues that are much more gender-based. So as Mark had referenced, sexual violence that kind of is much more characteristic for females than males. Human trafficking, which is an issue that I've been studying pretty closely. That is a much more widely represented in females than males. Family violence, domestic violence, all of these different things have a clear, not only disability-driven disparity, but also gender-based disparity. And when you combine those things, you result in some really significant social barriers that society is only now really starting to look at.
Yes, thank you so much. Those are some really, really great points. And with that, my next question is for Maysoon. Maysoon, we touched on how women with disabilities are disproportionately affected in so many different ways, from employment to education to sexual violence, etc. With those challenges that women with disabilities face, what do you think are some ways in which we can tackle this as a society, in terms of not only legislation, but in other ways?
Well, first of all, I have to take like a moment to just thank the three women on screen that have been like so influential in my personal life: Ruth Ann Harlange, Carol Jenkins, and my fairy god mentor, Lorraine Arbus, because I'm just blown away by the fact that we're actually really close to having an amendment added in our lifetime. And I think that road was paved by these extraordinary women who came before us, who gave us this opportunity. So I think it's really shocking to people when I tell them that the Equal Rights Amendment hasn't been ratified. Like, people think equality for women is guaranteed, and they think equality for disabled people is guaranteed.
Yes.
And those things are not. And I think that the reason that disability has to be part of this conversation is, while we are the largest minority in the world, we also intersect with every single community. So like when I do jokes on stage, I always say disability is the one group that you can join, whether you want to or not, regardless of race, religion, economic status, gender,
Yep.
who you love. Everyone is welcome. And we
Yep.
should be more like disability. And that's why I think it's so important that in this Equal Rights Amendment, disability is baked in, because we're often forgotten. You know, you have these Hollywood celebrities who I want to take a picture with and dress like and have their kind of makeup lines. And whenever they're listing all the diversity and inclusion groups, they're like LGBTQ, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, you know, women, and no one remembers to say disability. So I feel like if it is not actually spelled out in the definition of equality, that must apply to disabled people, we will be left behind. This year has been devastating to the disabled community in America. We have been told in no uncertain terms that we don't necessarily deserve to live, that if there's a choice between our lives and the lives of someone who identifies as non-disabled, the non-disabled person will be saved if push comes to shove. Having an amendment like this will stop that kind of discrimination by forcing people to treat us as equals, even though we are their greatest fear manifested. So when you talk about how do we not just make this a law or an amendment, but how do we have a shift in society? We have a shift in society by doing something really hard first, which is battling internalized ableism, by realizing that we do deserve equality, that we are fit to hold leadership positions, that we do need to, when we have the power, you know, I'm so blessed and lucky to be working in, you know, so many different fields where I get to pull up disabled people with me. I wish that I could lean on, you know, like this magical Dolly Parton like white savior that makes it all better. But like, I understand that when disabled people open the door, I have to take people with me. I have to walk into rooms and say, hey, we're going to start every meeting with an audio description. For those of you who can't see me, I look like the Lost Kardashian. I'm wearing age inappropriate sparkly lipstick. I'm sitting in front of an evil eye to kind of plant into people's ideas like, you might not know that the person across from you is disabled. You might have created an environment that's so unsafe, they feel the need to pass. But we are 20% of the population. We are in every room. And even though we're 20% of the population, we are 50% of the Americans killed by law enforcement. That statistic needs to change. And I feel like if we are included in the Equal Rights Amendment, that will kick open doorways for equality in education, equality in business, And one of the most important things, equal pay. Because currently in the United States of America, disabled people are forced to either be independently wealthy or dirt poor. And it's about time that we are paid equally. And that's a protection that could also come out of the ERA. So that's my manifesto, and I'll be back when Tatiana calls on me again.
Yes, I am for all of that. All of that. Pay me. So my next one is to Ryan. Ryan, we've talked about so much, and one of the things that the disability community that we use a lot is nothing about us without us. Do you think people with disabilities should be included in the decision making of state, local, and federal level? And why do you think this is important?
I mean, yes. What am I going to say? No. And of course, I think that we should be included in the decision making in state, local, and federal levels. And I think it stems from a lack of examples, a lack of people to look toward and say, oh, wow, I can do that too. When you're a young person, you know, that's when you're dreaming and modeling what you want to be in your life. Do you want to be a firefighter? Do you want to be a gymnast? Do you want to be a basketball player? Well, I was never going to be any of those three things, right? I have cerebral palsy and walk with a walker, and I'm, wasn't, I know what my limitations are. And sometimes people want you to overcome those limitations, but sometimes you just have to say, wake up and look at the reality. I'm not going to climb a ladder under any circumstance. Thank you so much. There are other people to climb the ladders, but there are metaphorical ladders, and there are ladders of leadership that we absolutely can assume in politics, beginning at the local level, of course. That's where so many politicians start, and then going up and up and up. We had a president of the United States who was in a wheelchair. It happened. It happened. But the American public did not know that he was disabled because it was hidden for the duration of his surplus term presidency. And imagine if it hadn't been. Imagine if in the 40s, we were able to see a leader who was a great president, who planted a lot, and a problematic, but they all are great and problematic, but he planted a lot of seeds for things and changes that still permeate our country today. And if it wasn't so seen as so shameful to be disabled back then, how the tide might have turned, how the needle might have moved so much faster. But that's what you have to think about. It happened already. It's not like there's no precedent. There is, but it was hidden. And so we need it to be out and proud. And okay, and there is currently a representative whose name I won't say, only because I don't know that I know enough about him. All I know is that he is a really awful individual. And by awful, do I mean conservative? Perhaps. That is, yes. But possessing the internalized ableism that Maysoon was speaking of, possessing this sort of belief in the inferiority of his body and therefore all of our bodies. And so, first of all, if we're going to have leaders in politics, it can't be that. It can't be that Hawthorne man there, I said his last name. It has to be someone who wants to uplift us and themselves and be proud of who we are, what our achievements are, what is possible intellectually, emotionally, and academically, I don't know other words to add that end in ly, but you know what I mean? And to have someone on a national stage who is you know, not hiding it in the way that FDR did, but exploiting it for his own benefit and to the detriment of all the rest of us, is really sort of vomit inducing and gross. And we need, you know, and that's part of the issue. You know, I'm an actor, and many of us here are, including you, many of us here are performers. And there's this idea that when we are represented in the media, as uncommon as that is, and as little as that is, that we have to be these angelic individuals who are perfect and we could do no wrong, and oh, aren't we wonderful? And we can't be complex and difficult and problematic and sometimes evil. Well, guess what? Some of us are. And it's not the trope that all disabled people are villains. That's the opposite end of the spectrum. And both extremes are wrong. Both extremes are wrong. But you, just because you are disabled doesn't mean you are exempt from flaws and biases that are harmful to other people, including your own community, a community that maybe you didn't want to be a part of in the first place, and a community that you don't want to embrace.
Yep.
So the last thing I'll say on this, nothing about us without us, is of course a very important mantra. We say it in the arts all the time. It applies to all areas of the government and of business and social interactions. Oh my gosh, we want to have social lives. Many of us are very social people, and we're closed off in this isolation because we are excluded from just the fabric of friendships and romances and things like that. I'll talk about that more in my next question. I do know what my next question but the thing is, you know, the reason that we need to be part of the decisions, whether it's government or business or other aspects of things, but we're here to talk about government, is because if we're not there to raise our hand, like Maysoon said, and that, oh, we need to do a visual description for those who are blind or low vision, or that we need captioning and ASL interpretation, because those are two different things and they are necessary for people in the deaf and hard of hearing communities. Or there's more to mobility disabilities than just ramps and automatic doors. There's so many more things. And if we're not there to raise our hands and say, hey, this is an oversight, or this is something that you should have thought of 10 years ago, or this is something that there's a law that 30 years ago says you should have enforced that and you still haven't, no one else is going to. And I am also very hopeful about the Biden-Harris administration. I fought very hard alongside a lot of people to make sure that they were elected. But the deficit of justice for disabled people in this country spans many an administration, including our beloved President Obama, who I adore, including Bill Clinton. You know, it isn't a Democrat-Republican issue. We have been overlooked for generations by all stripes of politicians. And so if we're not in the room, even the best intended folks are going to overlook us. And that is so, that is why we need a place at the table, a place at the bench, all kinds of areas of power. Having power. Oh yes, seating, yes. Having power, claiming power.
Tatiana, can I just piggyback a couple of things that Ryan said? First of all, I think it's so important to have advocates like Ryan, right? Because we talk about like stereotypes and biases, and like it's important for me to see an Arab man who is fighting for equal rights. I think it's really imperative that we have, you know, allies and people who are not the definition of what you think. And expanding on the definition of what you think, I want us to really fight for equal rights for disabled people who are not productive at all. I think that part of the game is that like you know, I always joke that I'm a super crip. Like, I'm writing a comic book, I have a TV show, I'm doing a TED Talk, I'm tap dancing on Broadway. My cat speaks. But I want us to fight for equal rights for disabled people who are nonverbal, who are not productive, who are not contributing to a capitalist society in any way, and kind of create through that space of equality something that was just like so cool that Ryan said, which was the idea that like we belong in every single space. And anywhere you include us, that's going to translate to money. The more inclusive you are, the bigger your tent is, the more money you're going to make. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because, like, yeah, it's all fun and games and trying to get people to give us equal rights. But if we can give them a financial incentive, that's really, really helpful. But whenever we do that, I worry about disabled people who are unable to be what is conventionally considered productive. And I think it's extremely important that as we fight for equal rights, we also fight for the rights of people who society thinks are expendable.
Yep, I agree. And Brooke touched on that a little bit earlier when she was talking about like people put this idea of, you know, what you're able to do. And if you can't do it, then you're disposable. I'm paraphrasing from what Brooke said, but
actually, I'd just like to jump in on that
go
point,
ahead.
right? So the mantra as pivotal and as you know, highly influential as it has been, you're nothing about us without us. Yeah, I think it is much better said, you're nothing without us, right? So
yeah,
we were talking about, you know, all sorts of issues that can be considered, you know, quote unquote disability related, when actually disability cuts across, you know, every topical area you can think of. And we need to be thinking differently about this. We need to have people, like, put people with disabilities on your boards of directors, right? Like, put people in with disabilities in all sorts of leadership positions. You're not just the conversations that have to do specifically with disability, but all conversations, because people with disabilities live very unique lives that are highly reliant on creativity every single day, creativity in navigating, you know, life's inevitable challenges. And that knowledge base, you know, that aspect of our identities is so valuable, right? It's so critical to the world that we're experiencing right now, that is plagued with so many challenges, that to not tap into that is to everybody's detriment.
Yes, I agree. Thank you so much for adding that. I will take this back to Mark. Mark, when working on state and local legislation based on the ERA, do you think it is important to specifically include disability, and why?
Yes, absolutely. For all the reasons that the other speakers have raised, persons with disabilities are excluded unless we raise the need to include us. And legislatures often look at civil rights laws outside of the context of people with disabilities. And if we do not focus their attention on how their efforts affect people with disabilities, they will learn too late that they've left us out. And that's just the nature of it. The nothing about us without us is more than just a mantra to try to force inclusion. It's a way of life. If we exclude people who we don't know, or we don't have familiarity with, or we don't understand the customs of, we exclude them, and we don't even know we're doing it. And so you can look at federal civil rights laws about voting. You can look at federal civil rights laws about employment, and they excluded people with disabilities. And for many of the advocates, they excluded women as well. And so we have to recognize that this is not just about people with disabilities. This is about women with disabilities. This is about transgenders, individuals with disabilities. The need to keep the focus on what about people with disabilities is essential. I think that's true too when you're trying to advocate for women's rights. When I was at the Office on Violence Against Women, my main job was go to meetings and say, well, what about women? When you're doing stuff about Social Security, what about women? And that's how I feel about doing ADA work. What about people with disabilities? Why are they not here? Why are you not inviting them? And why are you not even noticing that they're not here?
Yes.
And I think that's a common thread with civil rights, that it's not something to be given to us. It's something that we help build. And unless we're included to help build it, it will not be foundational for us.
I agree. Thank you so much for that. And for anyone watching or listening in, if you have any questions for our panelists, please put that in the Q&A box. We will get a chance to get to those, hopefully. So yeah, I want to make sure you have that. So if you have any questions that are for our panelists, this would be the perfect time to put in your questions. So next,
the questions can be shallow. They don't have to be related to the ERA.
Yes, any of your burning questions that you have for any of our panelists, get them in. So, Maysoon, I actually have this question for you. We've talked about women, we've talked about disability, we've talked about LGBTQ.
Are we going to talk about cats?
We can talk about cats. You have a cat that you're famous.
I have a cat named Beyonce. Go ahead.
And this is something that you and I share in common when it comes to the intersectionality of being a woman of color and being a woman of color and having a disability. What do you think are additional barriers when it comes to more intersectionality? I can't get my words out. Intersectionality, like being a woman of color with a disability,
Right.
etc. Can you speak a little bit on that and your experience?
So, in the very seldom times that disability is included, in the very, very seldom times that I'm not the only disabled person in the room, the majority of disability representation I grew up with and I currently see today are cisgendered straight white men. So disability itself is kind of thought of as like, you know, little white boys in wheelchairs giving you blankets. So like disabled women of color, Black women with disabilities are often completely left out of the conversation. And the reality is due to access, due to culture, sometimes brown and Black disabled women are less likely to get the services that they need, less likely to get early interventions. And my favorite thing about this intersection is that if you're a disabled person who fights for your rights, you're considered an angry Crip. But if you're a Black woman who fights for her rights, then you're also angry. So if you're a Black disabled woman fighting for your rights, it's like you're a terrorist in this kind of world. So being able to be part of the conversation is such a challenge because of access. And then when we become part of the conversation, it's kind of hard to explain to people that disability is not a monolith. And that when we're fighting for equality for all, and when we talk about, I can't remember who said it, I think it was Brooke, the idea of just nothing without us. The reason for nothing without us is what I said. We intersect into every community, but we're often left out of the conversation. And I want to address one very specific thing about being a woman, which piggybacks what Ryan said, which is sexuality. There's this idea that disabled people are happy snowflake angel babies that never grow up and never have sex. And I was writing a character for a sitcom and he was a Black gay wheelchair user. And the producers came to me and they said, he can be Black and gay, he can be Black and disabled, but he cannot be Black, gay, and disabled. And so I think that we're kind of educating society on the fact that not only do we exist, but we exist with all the nuance of any other community. And that as we fight for equality, we must in our own community acknowledge our privilege. I have talking privilege. You know, I have like amazing hair. I know a lot of people in the disabled community that are not as hot as me. So like, I have to understand that I have certain privileges that they don't. And you know what they always say, with like great power comes great responsibility. So again, like when we're having these conversations, it's not okay to have one white disabled person in the room speaking for all of us. We need Black women at the table. We need people who have faced different like microaggressions to be there. But we also need, and this is really complicated, I'm gonna make it really quick, to acknowledge the fact that disabled people can be parents, and that we can be spouses, and that we can be, you know, I know disabled people who have had their children taken away from them because they're disabled. I know people who have failed to adopt because they're disabled. There is a definite lack of equality and lack of humanity attached to disabled people. And nowhere do we see this more than circling back to violence against people with disabilities. There is a day of mourning for disabled people killed by their parents and caretakers. And when journalists report on those stories, they sympathize with the murderer instead of the murdered. Any other child that is killed, there is no sympathy for their murderer. But when it's a disabled child, you hear things like the mother was at the end of her rope. She had no support. The father was dying and he didn't know who would take care of the child. There is sympathy for our murderers. So when we talk about having to be included in the Equal Rights Amendment and movement, it is because currently in the richest, most educated country in the world, I know we're recovering from 4 years of darkness, but in a really civilized country, our murders are still acceptable. Our worth is still not recognized. So we must legislate our equality until our fellow humans acknowledge our equality.
Yes, exactly. I mean, people continue to think that we are disposable, and we are not disposable. Thank you so much. That was really, really great. Woo, that was good stuff, good stuff. So next, Ryan, the ERA covers gender, sexuality, and gender expression. Are there impacts felt by the LGBTQ community that aren't felt by hetero or cisgendered people?
Yes, I'm a gay person. Yes. And this conversation is so invigorating. It's so enlightening, and it makes me think of a million things. But I'm going to try to
I know.
answer the question and be succinct. But I promise it won't be that succinct. It's difficult because like there are all of these terrible things, like what Maysoon just said about not only murderers, but also children being taken away, and all of this vitriol that happens toward disabled folks. But it kind of, it happens regularly and continuously, but it's less like popular. It's less explicit. It's kind of, they go roundabout and they go under the rug, and it's not covered so much in the media in a way that's like, society hates disabled people. Like that banner, those headlines don't exist there. You have to dig a little deeper and see the patchwork. But to be a person who's LGBT is to know at any given time that half of the country hates you. Half of the country hates you, and they are not shy about it. And in fact, an entire political party is committed to the undermining of your rights and your human existence. We know that that's true across political lines for disability, but it's quieter. You know, it's less, it doesn't feel quite as much of an attack, which is why we also have to fight even harder, because people don't realize that those negative that negative energy is coming toward the disabled people. But all the time on a specific cable news channel every day, 24 hours a day, is vitriol toward LGBT people all the time. So if it's compounded and you're a disabled LGBT person, I mean, it's so hard, because when you think, I think about all the core issues that are faced with disabled folks and LGBT folks, which is lack of employment and a housing crisis, either not a right to be housed or homelessness, and there's another one. It's employment, housing, and there's a third one. I'm blanking. If somebody has it, tell me what it is.
Is it healthcare?
Yes, that's it. Thank you so much. Thank you. And those, like, it's just a double compound when you are a LGBTQ person who is disabled. I'm thinking of the kids, the teens, the youth that are still kicked out of their homes when they come out as gay, queer, or transgender. And if they are kicked out of their homes and taken to shelters, or there isn't room at shelters, and they're also disabled, like, what are we doing? How are we serving those people? It's really damaging, and it's really sad. And also, half the country hates us very loudly. They hate us, and their entire convention and their entire platform is explicitly toward hatred of us. Whereas in terms of disability, it's exclusion, and they ignore that we exist. When you're queer, they don't ignore you. They try to beat you down, and they try to strip away all of your humanity. How do I say this? I'm rambling, and I know, but because it's just so, it just ties me up in an emotional bind. It really does.
Yeah.
Because when you're disabled, they just assume that your humanity doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So they don't.
Yeah.
They're not afraid to take it away because they don't think it exists at all in the first place. Whereas with LGBT, as they see you get more rights, earn more rights continually, history is on our side, that our rights are improving with every year and with every progressive administration. They see that as a threat to them. And so they see that our humanity is being acknowledged, and they're doing everything they can to rescind that, because they think it directly combats their humanity, which is completely fucking absurd. But I need to finish, and I'm sorry. Oh my gosh, I swore I shouldn't have done that. I'm so sorry.
Oh no, it's fucking okay. We're all fucking adults here.
But I want to say one last thing.
Okay.
So I'm a gay, I've said I'm a gay person with cerebral palsy. And, I want to be touched. I want to be loved. I am horny, as that video said very clearly. I'm horny. And COVID is not helping the horniness by any means. But the thing about it is, and I love both communities, the disabled community and the LGBT community, but I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that when I go into an LGBT space, there is not room for me as a disabled person there. I am left out. My body is left out. My mobility device is left out. I am stared at. I am made to feel like I don't belong there, because how could a disabled person possess sexuality and therefore identify as LGBT? T is not sexuality, it's gender based, of course, transgender. But it's the idea of, you're not one of us, but yes, I am. Yes, I am. And those LGBT spaces often are up many flights of stairs. And no thought is given to the fact that I might want to enter, and I might want to have a drink, and I might want to dance with somebody, and I might want to make out with somebody. all those things are so, human contact is so important, and human intimacy is so important, and we are denied it. And I think that that's true of all disability, is denied that. But to so strongly identify as, I'm a man who's attracted to men, there's a whole community and a whole rainbow flag that is supposed to say that I am part of them, and they don't see it that way. That it's there's a level of being turned away by your own people. And I'm a third generation Lebanese American gay disabled man. And so when one of those groups says to me on a given day, no, you're not welcome here, how is that supposed to make me feel? Because I know who I am, and you can't take away my identity, but you certainly are going to try. And I don't have an ending sentence, so I'm just going to stop talking.
It's
Bravo,
all good.
bravo.
You're saying some amazing, powerful stuff that needs to be said. So thank you so much for your openness and your vulnerability and honesty, which is refreshing. So thank you. So we have one more question for Brooke, and then we'll go into our question. But the question I want to ask you is actually somewhat of a question, one of our questions that came in. So the question that came in said, what should non-disabled people do besides fight for the ERA and be sure disabled folks are at the table? Which kind of goes into my question I had for you, Brooke, or what are some other policies and practices that you think need to be implemented to affect change for women with disabilities? So if you can kind of answer both of those encompassed.
All right. I'll tie them together as best as I possibly can. All right, so
Go for it.
All right. So let me start out by saying how incredibly rich and important this conversation was. I mean, I would say that it was fun, because I mean, it was fun on some level, but it was much more important than it was fun, right? Because we touched on so many really critical things that need to be talked about right now, but are so rarely talked about. We don't ever really have these kinds of conversations, or at least we do far too rarely, because I mean, they're difficult, and they force society to look at people with disabilities in ways that they're not really willing to or ready to. And I think that's critical in and of itself, right? That is something that needs to change. That's the lever or the mechanism that needs to be pressed in order to get any of these conversations and ultimately any of these changes headed in the right direction. So this conversation was just, despite the fact that it was a little bit freewheeling sometimes, like that's the kind of conversations we need to have, things that are just like human and real and natural, and show people who don't live with disability what people with disabilities are like, really, like that they are human beings, have the same wants and desires and needs as everybody else, and long to have the same kind of lives as everybody else, is just kind of very reflexively afforded the opportunity to have. So I just wanted to get that out there to start, and like understanding your life in terms of living with a disability and in all of these complex conversations or parts of society is difficult to do. It requires work, it requires self-analysis, reflection, and a lot of thinking, a lot of self-confidence to put yourself out there so people know what life is really like and can include you in a much more proactive way. So shifting gears, talking about kind of policy and kind of more governmental levers to push. So I do work on disability in an international context, right? And there are issues of international development and kind of how the United States and other countries provides financing to developing countries, and what is often put into place, or sometimes put into place, are what's called conditionalities. And that is kind of like, if we are going to provide you with resources to develop, we want you to meet certain criteria, and sometimes accessibility and inclusion is one of those conditionalities. And the United States would lose a lot of moral standing if the conditionalities that it put on other parts of the world were not the ones that they embrace here at home. And seems to be increasingly the case, right? Especially under the Trump administration, when not even kind of in secret, but very overtly, very publicly, where people with disabilities disparaged or made to feel like they were worthless or not a part of the social fabric, right? Like these are lived human rights abuses that people with disabilities experience every single day, right? Microaggressions and macroaggressions that they experience every single day. We can't, in any good conscience, hold other parts of the world to these standards if we don't embrace them here at home. So like a constitution is a country's mission statement, basically, right? It is a reflection or documenting of what it holds dear, what it values, what future it aspires to bring to bear. And if people with disabilities and women are not included in that document, then who are we really? Who do we want? Who are we? Who do we want to be as a country? And we have just lived through this tremendous, gut-wrenching pandemic that has taken such a heavy toll on people with disabilities and not really spoken about at the level that it should be, but has taken a serious toll, a very heavy toll on people with disabilities. That said, we are at a moment when we can get things right. We can do things better, right? This pristine opportunity to do it differently. An opportunity that may not ever present itself ever again. And if we are going to build back better, if we're going to look at all the international development initiatives that we're doing in other parts of the world and not look at them in with the same critical eye here in the United States, then we are going to fail. Right, so building back better has to mean building back fairer, building back in a more equal way, a more inclusive way, a more loving way, and that's where I think this conversation needs to go. Right, now is the time, now is the moment, now is the time to think of things bigger and more boldly and more inclusively, and to not mince our words in any way, shape, or form, but to be very forthright about how we do it, very deliberately inclusive. Like that's where we need to be, and the time is now. The time actually should have been decades ago, but it is certainly now. And we can do it if we actually believe that we can and take the time to do it.
Yes, I agree. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to all our panelists. This was such an enlightening, wonderful conversation. I am so honored to have moderated this. And with that, we have ran a little over. So people that have stayed tuned longer, thank you so much for staying engaged. And I will take it back to Carol. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so very, very much. We decided Sunday night when we had our pre-call, and I had so much fun and learned so much in that first call that we were going to do part 2. And after tonight, we know that there'll probably be part 2 and 3 and 4. Because, what I said after that conversation, I have the best job in the world. I had a conversation, like that. I want to thank you all so much. Ruth Ann Harnish, Lorraine Arbus, our terrific panel, Brooke, Maysoon, Ryan, Mark, and Tatiana. And we thank respectability.org. Please check them out. A terrific organization. And we hope that you will take a look at our website, eracoalition.org, to donate, to get involved, to sign up for our newsletter, find out more about it. This is the year of the ERA. This is going to happen. And from this conversation, you see why it absolutely has to happen. As Brooke says, the time is now. We've got to do it now. Our next town hall will be on February 22nd, an exploration of the ERA and Native Americans and Alaskan Native. We hope you will join us for that. And in the meantime, please check us out. Be safe, be happy, and thank you for joining us in this conversation. We'll see you the next time.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.